Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. So, welcome. Thank you for being here today. For me, it's a pleasure to be back in Bologna. My name is Sanam Vakil, and I'm really excited to have my colleague, Professor Jonathan Fulton, visiting us. He's from Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. He's going to talk to us about his work. He is a scholar of China, and particularly China's engagement politically and economically in the Middle East. He's recently published a fantastic book called Building the Belt and Road Initiative in the Arab World, China's Middle East Math. So looking forward to hearing about Jonathan's research, and then looking forward to the conversation. I am just going to read Jonathan's bio and then hand the floor over to him. Jonathan is Associate Professor of Political Science in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, and he's also a non-resident fellow for the Middle East Program and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan is an expert on Chinese policy towards the Middle East. He's written widely on the topic for academic as well as popular publications. He's the author of another book known as China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies, and today he's going to talk to us about his recently published book. He's also edited and co-edited other volumes, such as External Power and the Gulf Monarchies, Regions in the Belt and Road Initiative, the Rutledge Handbook of China-Middle East Relations, and Asian Perceptions of Gulf Security. Jonathan has published over 30 journal articles, book chapters, reports, dozens of op-eds and analytical pieces. He is a regular commentator in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and BBC, and he is the host of the Atlantic Council's popular China Mena podcast and publisher of the China Mena newsletter. So we're lucky to have such an expert here today that will unpack a lot of the misperceptions, lay out the realities of China's engagement in the region. So welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Anam. I need to update that and make it like way shorter. But anyway, thanks. It's really great to be here. Great to be in Bologna. I've never been here before. I'm really enjoying it. Really appreciate the chance to come and visit everybody at Johns Hopkins SAIS here today. Yeah, so I've got a book out, and it's pretty good timing. One thing I've come to realize is anything about China or the Middle East is always good timing because it's always in the news. There's always something happening. And it's been really interesting for me. I started working on China Middle East stuff quite a while ago. I've lived in the Gulf since 2006. Before that, I lived in Taiwan and Korea for quite a while. So I've been watching China for most of my adult life. And when I went to the Middle East, I thought, great, I'm done, I'll look at something else. And realized pretty quickly that this is a topic nobody was thinking much about, that China was quite actively involved in the Middle East in a way that wasn't really understood. I started working on my dissertation. I remember talking to somebody who worked for a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, and I was interviewing him to collect data, right? And he asked me why I'm doing such a silly thing. How are you ever going to write 100,000 words on we sell cheap junk and we buy oil? And that was kind of the way people saw China in the Middle East. By the time I finished the dissertation, published the book, this was great timing. The week that my book came out, Xi Jinping came to Abu Dhabi. And there's only one book in the world about the topic. So thanks, Xi Jinping, if you're watching. I'm sure he is. One of the things is it went from being a very niche and under-examined and unusual topic to being something that everybody saw everywhere. And suddenly it's in the news all the time. And the problem with the news is that it kind of forgets what happened last week, right? So there's an event that happens and people kind of take this event as an isolated event. Xi Jinping went to Riyadh in December 2022, and they signed tens of billions of dollars worth of deals and MOUs. He had a summit with China-Saudi summit, China-GCC summit, and a China-Arab League summit. And everybody went, oh my God, what does this mean? China's taking over the Middle East. And this came just shortly after Joe Biden. He had visited Saudi in July of that year, and it was a pretty unsuccessful visit. So of course, this also feeds into this great power competition. You know, the US just had a bad visit with Saudi and China had a good one. China's beating America, like it's a chess game between the states and the PRC. The good thing about watching it over the longer arc, you know, doing it academically, is you see all of these visits and you put them in the context of what came before and what's the largest strategic ambitions and visions, and you start to see patterns. And those patterns will tell you things like the China-US competition, which is very real in much of the world, doesn't really factor into the Middle East. And most people in the Middle East kind of reject the idea that there's great power competition, that they have to be very worried about. Mostly I see it as an opportunity, you know, especially most countries where I live in the Arabian Peninsula are very, very reliant on the relationship with the US across so many different, whether it's political, diplomatic, economic, technological, the whole gamut, right? Now, that's not to say it's a good relationship. There's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of pressures. US presidents tend to do not the smartest thing sometimes, and that plays out in the rest of the world. And in the Gulf, they take that stuff pretty seriously. But with China, they look at it and they think, this is a country we trade with. You know, there's nothing really strategic about it. You're an important trading partner, you're an important investor in infrastructure, doing contracting, stuff like this. But it's not really the same category, anywhere close to the same category as the US, right? I keep telling people, when you think of China and the Middle East, think of it on kind of on par with Germany, Turkey, Russia, France, you know, powerful countries with a lot of influence, kind of operating at that second or third tier of power and influence internationally. The US is its own thing. But anyhow, I digress. Back to the book. I've been looking at what China's doing in the Middle East for quite a while. There's been a very structured way that China's done this. One thing that China created is called the China-Arab States Cooperation, or China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. Every 2 years, for the past 22 years, all the foreign ministers, all the Arab League countries and China will meet. Either they alternate between Beijing or an Arab capital city. And they map out, what are we going to do for the next 2 years? Almost always it's things like development, trade, investment, technological cooperation, stuff like this. It's very rarely anything strategic, diplomatic, or security focused. In 2014, it was held in Beijing, and Xi Jinping gave the opening address, and he gave this kind of cryptic statement, let's focus on building the 1+2+3 cooperation framework. And everybody went, yeah, sure, what's that? That is the math in the subtitle of my book, China's Middle East Math. Each of these numbers in the equation are a different sector or type of engagement that China wants to promote. So one is traditional hydrocarbons, mostly China buying oil and gas. Two is trade and investment and infrastructure construction. Three is renewable energy, nuclear energy, and space satellites. Basically, much like the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, this was China saying, these are the things we've already had a lot of success in developing with Arab countries. This is stuff we've already been focused on for quite a while. But like the Belt and Road, if we put it under this umbrella, this brand, and say this is something that the state is promoting, the federal government of China is promoting, then it makes it easier for provinces, municipalities, lending institutions, state-owned enterprises, whatever, to say, hey, this is something that the government wants us to pursue. They're going to support it. So kind of like the BRI, if a Chinese state-owned energy or a state-owned enterprise could say, this is a BRI project, it gets a stamp, right? People in Beijing will say, great. Kind of like you're meeting our KPIs. Same thing, you know, if you're a executive for Beidou, the space satellite company in China, and say, look, I'm going to Egypt and I want to launch a satellite for Egypt, it's part of the 1+2+3. Great, let's do it. So this thing came out, it was announced in 2014, almost nobody paid any attention to it. We've now had a decade of it. And my idea with the book was, let's look at the past 10 years and see what has been successful, what hasn't been successful. Is there anything that is performing in an unusual way? One of the issues I have living in the Gulf has always been the story. China does so much, especially with Saudi, the UAE, and Iran to a degree, that when we think of China in the Middle East, we think of China in the Gulf. And as I started working on this book, I had this kind of naive optimism. I think, hey, there's a story nobody knows yet, and I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to see that China is like really big in Tunisia, or they're doing a lot with Jordan or something. Yeah, that didn't happen. You know, basically it's the Gulf. And part of the reason for that is because the Gulf is where the money is, you know. They have the money to you know, invest or to buy into Chinese space satellite programs. They have the money to buy a lot of Chinese renewable energy programs. They have the money to, you know, give Chinese contractors a ridiculous amount of money, and they have. So it's been interesting. I mean, just what I did in the book is I looked at each of these, you know, elements, each part of the equation. What am I seeing? Which countries are the most successful? Which are the least successful? And what's happening? And yeah, so it's basically a story about the GCC. And of that, it's basically a story of the UAE and Saudi. These are the countries that have the most systematic relationships with China. They've put a lot of energy into developing these relations. The UAE has by far the biggest Chinese population in the Middle East. I don't know if you were watching the 12-day war between Iran and Israel earlier this year, but in June, China had to evacuate all of its Chinese citizens who were living and working in Iran. And if you were watching CNN, or if you read the, you know, Wall Street Journal or whatever, you'll hear a lot about this China-Saudi 25-year cooperation agreement, which is often mischaracterized as an alliance. You hear about how China's going to pour $400 billion.
China-Iran. China-Iran.
China-Iran, yeah. Sorry, what did I say? Oh, yeah, China-Iran. Yeah, the China-Iran is this really, really, really big story, and it's classic misdirection. China does very little with Iran. So when they had to evacuate all of the Chinese citizens out of Iran, they announced what that was. They said it's between 2,000 and 3,000 people. The Chinese ambassador to the UAE gave a speech last fall. He said there's about 400,000 Chinese living in the UAE. Now, basic math, Iran has about 90 million people. The UAE has about 10 million people. If there's 400,000 in tiny UAE and there's about 2,000 in huge Iran, that tells you a lot, right? Just in terms of the investment that Chinese companies do, they do almost nothing in Iran. And the reason why is because money is smart and money is cowardly. I'm not going to put my money in a country if I think Israel's going to blow that country up, right? But they know that the UAE is a safe bet. They know that they've got a great infrastructure. They've got champagne brunches every weekend. You can have a very comfortable, pleasant lifestyle living in Dubai or Abu Dhabi that you're not going to have in most of Iran. So there's a very big Chinese presence in the Emirates, in Saudi, to a lesser extent Egypt, to a lesser extent Qatar. But you're seeing basically a pattern of China being very much a status quo-oriented country in the Middle East. The story that you keep seeing is, you know, China and Iran are going to, you know, subvert regional order. Bashar al-Assad leaves, and China's going to jump in and like jump into Syria and reconstruct it. China's going to go into Yemen or Libya and fix these countries and compete with the US and take over the Middle East. Again, the reality is Chinese companies are very risk averse. They don't want to go into high risk countries. They can make more than enough money in Abu Dhabi. They can make more than enough money in Saudi. Why would they go to Syria, you know, where their employees could get kidnapped, where they're worried about blowback from people from the Syrian military who are Uyghur separatists who want to target the Communist Party back in China. And again, when you look at this kind of narrative of great power competition playing out, what you see really is China's closest partners in the Middle East are the US's closest partners in the Middle East, you know, and that's because those are the countries that are reliable markets, that are reliable political actors, that are countries that promote stability. And again, that's what Chinese companies want. They want stable markets. It's weird. I talk to a lot of Chinese people in the Gulf. They're teachers, they're small business owners, they're engineers. You know, they're not great power competitors. They're just normal people trying to start a business and have a normal life. At the same time, this is taking place in this larger international situation. And it's true, you know, what China and the US are doing, what China's doing in the Middle East can be disruptive. It does have the potential to disrupt a pretty delicate ecosystem. When I talk to Israelis, which I do somewhat frequently, they get very nervous about the China-Iran relationship. And I keep telling them, you're reading too much into this. China doesn't like Iran. China doesn't trust Iran. The same goes the other way. Iran doesn't really like or trust China either. It's very much a friendship of convenience. It's two countries that Iran doesn't have too many other options, you know. For China, they're like, hey, all we have to do is say we're doing something with Iran, and then the US freaks out. It's awesome. They're never going to relocate, they're never going to move their ships from Bahrain and put them in the South China Sea where they should be and compete with China, you know, in Asia, because Iran is getting empowered by China's, you know, rhetorical support. So for China, it's kind of a low-cost chip that they can play to keep the US distracted in the Middle East. But again, back to the point where the Israelis would get quite upset about this, you know, saying, we get that what China does with Iran is not that significant, but every dollar's worth of Iranian oil that they buy, every weapon they sell to Iran has the potential to either end up with Hezbollah or Hamas. It has potential to blow up an apartment block in Tel Aviv or something. So they see it as a very difficult, problematic relationship. I think most of the rest of the Middle East doesn't. You know, I had coffee with an Emirati official a couple of weeks ago, and as we were talking about China, he was saying, I don't understand why you guys in the West are always freaking out about this. Like, we see them in very transactional terms. We do business with us, or we do business with them. We trade with them. That's about it. Why do you see this as a problem? I was like, well, it's different. You know, if you are in the Emirates, in most of the Arab world, it's just a place for China to go and make money. It's not strategically that important to China. If you're from Canada, like I am, the stuff that China does is very disruptive to our political system. And we see it differently because they treat us differently. If you're a Chinese Canadian citizen who has family back in China, it's very normal that the Communist Party will lean on your family in China to say, we want you to vote a certain way in Canada. If you're a Chinese Canadian who's running for office in Canada, you're going to get your opponent's going to get a lot of funding or support from the party to try to, you know, keep you out of office. Despite the, you know, non-interference into the domestic affairs of other countries, the PRC interferes a lot. But it doesn't so much in the Middle East, not so much. And I guess that's another point that I think is pretty interesting. Whenever I talk to Americans about this, they tend to see China as a global threat, kind of like a 100-foot giant. I keep reminding my American friends that they're pretty blessed. You've got the Arctic Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, you've got the Pacific. To your north, you have like a bunch of really awesome Canadians who don't really threaten you that much. You know, we're pretty nice. And then you've got Mexico, which is slightly less nice, but still pretty cool. It's a pretty generous endowment, you know, to have that kind of strategic landscape. If you're going to take over the rest of the world, you couldn't do worse, right, than to have that. Whereas if you're in Beijing and you're thinking, I'm going to take over the rest of the world, now what am I going to get around first? Well, I share land borders with 14 countries. Some of those countries are North Korea, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. You know, there's weaker, fragile states, there are aggressive states, there are hostile states like India, Vietnam, there are US allies or partners. It's not a very easy strategic landscape, just in their immediate periphery. That's to say nothing of the maritime borders with a lot of other countries. There's a really great book if you're interested in doing research on Chinese foreign policy. It's two Americans, Andrew Nathan at Columbia and Andrew Scobell, who was at the USIP when there was such a thing. They wrote this book in 2012 called China's Search for Security. And what they did was they used a concentric circles model to kind of lay out the hierarchy of China's foreign policy objectives. The inner circle, which occupies almost all of the party's energy and resources, is China's very, very, very tricky domestic situation. You know, there are big gaps between urban and rural. The economy is in bad shape. It's really hard to get all these young people jobs. You've got Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong. You've got all these regions within the country that aren't particularly happy. excuse me, with the federal government, you know, China's really hard to govern, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. I feel bad sometimes for the leaders thinking like just the things they have to deal with are so overwhelming. And honestly, that's the big part of their job, is just how do we manage this very tricky domestic situation. You know, there was a point where, you know, back pre-COVID, when China, or I guess 10 years ago, when China was still averaging about 10% growth a year, they're like every percent was basically 1 million jobs. That was the way they looked at it. We have 10 million university grads coming through the pipelines every year. If we hit 9% growth, which would be the envy of everybody in the world, that means we have a million university students we can't find jobs for. That's 1 million people who are going to be super mad at us. So 10% wasn't like a luxury, it was a necessity. We have to hit this all the time, or else our legitimacy is really undermined. So their domestic situation is very precarious. There's a lot going on inside China. And I think anybody who's studying foreign policy would do really well to really focus on what's happening inside the country that you're trying to learn more about, because that's just the story, right? The second circle is that periphery I mentioned, all the countries, the land borders, the maritime borders around China, which occupies, again, if you are the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you've got to think not abstractly, you've got to think in very real terms. I got 14 countries on my borders that I've got to manage all the time. That's not easy. The third circle is these Asian subregions. You know, there's Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia. All of these have their own kind of operating systems, the way they work. They all have different international fora, they've got organizations, they've got all these different things that, again, occupy a lot of resources and time. And then there's the fourth circle, which is just everything else. And that is where the Middle East is. That's where Africa is. That's where Latin America is. Everything else is the stuff we don't have to care too much about. You know, the stuff that's not going to occupy a lot of our time, a lot of our money, a lot of our talent. Now, I gave a talk to a bunch of American diplomats earlier this week, and they were asking a lot of questions about how China's mediation in the Middle East might change things. I'm sure you saw a couple of years ago, there was the Saudi-Iran détente, which was announced in Beijing, and everybody went, oh my God, China's like fixing the Middle East. And then, you know, Mahmoud Abbas went to Beijing, and the Chinese foreign minister at the time, Qin Gang, who only lasted about 200 days in his job before he disappeared, said, hey, we're going to invite Benjamin Netanyahu to come and visit us in October of 2023. And then we're going to solve Israel and Palestine too. You know, there's all this talk about China's becoming a major diplomatic actor in the region. The reality is, if you're a Chinese diplomat and you speak Arabic, that's awesome. You're going to be very useful in like the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is where the Middle East people are working. If you want to be fast-tracked to promotion, if you want to be the minister, you'll be the ambassador to Japan or to London or to Washington. The Middle East is its own thing, and it's not that important. It's where China goes to make money. It's where China goes to get energy. Now, maybe I'm being a little flippant, but I just really have to stress it's not that important to China. The South China Sea is important to China. The East China Sea is important to China. The Middle East is not that important. And you can see when October 7th happened, China did almost nothing. When the Red Sea shipping crisis happened, China did nothing. When the war between Israel and Iran happened, China did nothing. At any point since October 7th and this week, China's done nothing. They'll make statements, they'll offer rhetorical support to Palestinians, they'll offer rhetorical support to Iran, but they don't do anything in material terms, right? And the reason is it's not that important to them. What's important to them is making money there, getting energy there, and using that money and using that energy to make their own domestic situation much stronger and more stable, so they don't have to worry about 1.4 billion people watching an Arab Spring type situation and getting ideas. So if I can leave you with anything, it's that. Like, yes, China-Middle East is a very important thing, thankfully, because it's basically all I do. But it's important to right size it, to realize that it's an important thing, much like BRICS is an important thing, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an important thing, or the EU GCC strategic debate or strategic is an important thing, but it's not something that's going to overturn global order, right? When you see the news coming out of CNN or whatever that's saying once again like China and Iran is something we all have to worry about, I'm just telling you, you don't have to worry about that. There's other things to focus your worry on. China, Iran isn't one of them for now. So I'll stop here because I'd much rather hear from you than hear from myself. So I'd be more interested in your questions and comments and all that stuff.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. You've given us quite a tour of the book, but also I appreciate that you've really honed in on oftentimes what is misunderstood about China's dynamics in the Middle East. While everyone is gathering their thoughts and questions, I just want to ask you, China experts like yourselves and China experts that are based in the region and examine China-MENA ties continue to face this sort of uphill battle in Western capitals about China. And this could say everything about Western capitals and their understanding of China, but we won't go there. What about in the Middle East itself? Because certainly over the past few years, beyond the trade, there has been more diplomatic visits to Beijing. There's been, this, I always entertained when the number of Confucius institutes are reported to be increasing in the region. A few years ago, it was reported that the United Arab Emirates was potentially, maybe, possibly opening a Chinese, or allowing the Chinese to open a military base. Right. This weighs heavily in the minds of policymakers in Washington, even with the Trump administration. The chips, that they're waiting for to anchor their AI strategy, potentially could be tied up in questions and uncertainty over their relationship with China. So tell me about the Gulf states. Are they looking to hedge and not have to pick sides in what they see as a geopolitical battle between, the U.S. and Beijing, or is something else going on in the region that we're not seeing?
Yeah, that's a different lecture. You got to fly me back to do the Gulf one. No, I mean, how the Gulf sees it, that word transactional I didn't use by accident. The UK Ministry of Defense asked me to write a report on China's growing diplomatic outreach to the Middle East, I guess for January. So I published with the Atlantic Council public, like open source. So you can find it easily enough. But what I did, the idea was they saw all of these things from the Xi visit to Saudi to the Saudi-Iran rapprochement to the President Raisi visit, the BRICS expansion, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization expansion, all of this, and they said, how are Middle Eastern publics and governments perceiving this? Are they seeing China in different terms? Are they starting to see China as an important diplomatic actor? So I interviewed people in Egypt, Israel, UAE, Saudi, and Iran, and asked all of them the same questions. And everybody, scratch that, everybody except one person had kind of a stronger vision of China as a very important partner, but even he would acknowledge that China didn't do much, but he was kind of conspiratorial. China would like to solve Palestine, China would like to help Iran, but America won't let them, So it was all America's fault that China wasn't being successful at this. But otherwise, everybody else they kept saying the word transactional over and over and over again. And they said, we don't see China in strategic terms at all. We see China as a partner for economic issues or development issues. And they stress that as something important, right? Like, we all know that China was one of the least developed countries in the world in the late 70s, and then Deng Xiaoping starts this era of reform, and China goes from one of the least developed countries in the world to the second biggest economy in the world. That's very enticing in the Middle East, where a lot of governments are underperforming or have had a hard time, solving that development puzzle. How did China manage to do this? What lessons can we learn from them? They take that very seriously. They see the trade relationship as important, but they don't see it as having you know, the point I made about Chinese diplomats having little knowledge, they're more aware than anybody, right? They're like, China doesn't understand us and they don't care about us that much. So they kept saying transactional. We do stuff that matters, but we don't do the most important stuff. Now, the flip side of that, the Gulf side, I mean, if I open my WhatsApp and pull out all of the Gulf or Chinese expertise in the Gulf, I know one person in Kuwait. She's a member of the royal family, so she can't really do a lot of public stuff though. So it's kind of an isolated expertise. I know 2 people in Saudi. I know a married couple in the Emirates that both speak Chinese and both have a lot of experience. I don't know anybody in Doha. Like, people aren't studying China. Yes, there are a lot of Confucius institutes. There's one directly below my office at Zayed University. It's almost always empty. You know, the people that go there are mostly high school kids, international students who want to have something on their university applications to say, like, I'm learning something else. The university students at my campus are much more interested in learning Japanese or Korean because they love manga and anime and they love K-pop. Seriously. They don't see China as that useful. Now, the government has rolled out a K-12 Chinese language program past couple of years. The Saudis have done this as well. That doesn't mean that everybody who's doing that takes it seriously. I mentioned I'm from Canada. When I was growing up, we all had to do French classes starting in grade 3. Most of my classmates can count to 10 in French and they know the colors and that's it. They never really went too far in it. You know, you got to a point in grade 7 where you could choose, do you want to go in the immersion program and do it seriously or not? Most people resented it. They're like, why would I want to learn something that doesn't affect my day-to-day life? And I think that's how a lot of the students feel about the Chinese language program. I talk to teachers and like the students are very reluctant. They're very dismissive. They might as well be trying to teach them chemistry, you know? So there's not a lot of China expertise in the Middle East. The countries that have the most of it are Iran and Israel. You don't find much anywhere else. That will change, just like China's expertise on the region is changing. China just started in the past few years a really ambitious area studies program, and you'll see in universities where they're putting a lot of funding into research about the rest of the world. And it's interesting because if you think about the US at the start of the Cold War, there wasn't a lot of funding for the rest of the world. There weren't a lot of area studies programs in all the best universities. You know, America wasn't really an outward-looking power, you know, early Cold War. It was just that realization, we have to understand the rest of the world better if we're going to have a bigger role in shaping the norms and the rules and the practices. And I think when China rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the same logic started to apply where China went from seeing itself as a regional actor, an Asian country, to a country with global interests and global responsibilities. And now you're starting to see people, you know, there are very few Chinese Middle East experts. They're amazing. They're really good. They've got great language skills. They do great work, but there's not many of them. But what they're doing is they're training the next generation who will change. You know, we'll see in about 2 generations, we're going to see like a really great, robust program. We're not seeing that in the Middle East yet. Like my university doesn't have any area studies classes at all, at all. I taught a independent studies class on Chinese foreign policy. The last time I did was 2016. Like we don't do any of that stuff. So, you know, students in the region aren't really looking at China. I mean, everything at my university is done in English. All my students know everything about the US, everything. They have their favorite Kardashians and they know everything. But I asked them, like last week, I was reviewing a journal article about Arab perceptions of China in the US after October 7th. And the findings were predictable. All the Arab people they talked to said, we don't like America and we do like China. I'm like, well, why do you like China? You know, it's a more interesting question. Who's the president? Mr. Lee? Like, what's the capital city? Hong Kong. Name a Chinese movie star. Bruce Lee. And like, he's from California. You know, like, there's very little cultural fluency. There's very little academic knowledge being generated about China in the Arab world right now. That probably will change too as they start to see it as a more important country. But we're at very early days of this.
But you sidestepped the government side of the question.
Yeah, same.
So the Brits and the Americans, are they just nervous for no reason?
I didn't sidestep it on purpose. I just forgot because I talked too much. I mean, it's the same. Like, so we did this project for the Atlantic Council where we went to Egypt, we went to Saudi, we went to Israel. We said, bring together all of the best China watchers in government or in academia or in think tanks or whatever. Most of those countries had a hard time finding any, right? So you're not finding a lot of people that are developing in-house that knowledge. They're starting to send people, like a month ago, Khaled Al-Fallah, the Minister of Investment, went to, for Saudi Arabia, led a delegation of about 100 people to China, did a 3-city stop. He knows China probably better than anybody. He was the CEO of Aramco. He was the Minister of Energy. He's done every job that involves having China expertise. And he's the Minister of Investment. And I'm repeating that because typically when a head of state or a leading minister like that goes to China, it used to be they'd have like tens of billions of dollars in MOUs that they'd announced. When he went, they announced nothing. And the big reason, I think, is because they look at the Chinese economy and think, we don't want to put our money there right now. So what they know about China is mostly based on their economic relations. I asked a lot of senior officials about how do you see China as a diplomatic, political security partner. They all say the same thing. We don't. We see it as a country that we do business with. And that's pretty much true everywhere, except, again, Iran.
Okay, thank you. I think there's lots more for me to pepper you with, including talking about the energy relationships, renewables, and how that's going to affect the Arab-Gulf relationship, the Gulf-Arab relationship with China. But let me give everyone here an opportunity. If you raise your hand and then introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for the talk.
Hold on one second.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name's Benjamin Sanders. I'm a second-year student here, trying to specialize in China, but there's a lot to specialize in. I wanted to ask about, you said earlier that they're risk-averse in the Middle East, and I just wanted to ask where the kind of boundaries for that lie, because I know in Pakistan they have a lot of Chinese citizens who are attacked by terrorists, but they're committed to this infrastructure project to go all the way to the port, and they're kind of willing to put up with that even, yeah. And so I wanted to ask, like, where is the boundary for that? Why is that an issue or not an issue, you think, in the Middle East? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I went to Pakistan, I've only been once, it was in 2016, and I was surprised at just how many Chinese people I saw walking around in Lahore, and they felt very, very safe and very comfortable. At that time, that was shortly, the China-Pakistan economic corridor was announced, I believe, in 2015. And it was seen as, China had committed $47 billion worth of projects in Pakistan. And there was this moment where, the US had been sending $2 billion a year to Pakistan to fight, in Afghanistan, basically, and to fight terrorism. China was saying, we're doing it differently. You can build roads, pipelines, schools, hospitals, whatever, So China was seen as a pretty positive actor at that point. That has changed, because you mentioned the port, and that's the crown jewel of this project, the port in Gwadar, which is meant to create a transit corridor for Persian Gulf energy to get from Gwadar port in Pakistan south up to Xinjiang on China's west. And Gwadar is a disputed territory. The people who live there aren't getting the economic benefits from that, and they're very, very upset about it, and there's a lot of tension within the country. And what they've been doing is increasingly taking it out on Chinese nationals who they see as supporting elites in Islamabad who undermine the Baluchis' ambitions for more autonomy. So it's become a situation where domestic politics in Pakistan are creating a physical threat for Chinese who live there, and they've had to bring in these private security companies to start acting there. which the Pakistani government has allowed. I can't understand why, for the life of me, they would allow foreign security actors to operate with impunity inside their sovereign territory. But it's a big issue because when a Chinese citizen is killed in Pakistan, there's tremendous pressure on the government back home. You know, there used to be a much more lively online ecosystem in China, and you know, when something like that would happen, people would go onto their chat apps, or they go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they would just berate them. Who are you people? You know, you ask us to go overseas and you can't protect us. And they get in a lot of trouble for this. And of course, they've shuttered most of those opportunities for public dialogue within China these days, so it's harder for that to happen. But there's serious pressure. The last time I talked to a Chinese friend about the case in Pakistan, he was mortified. He's like, we thought this was going to be the one thing that would work for us, and now they're killing us. So this was last fall we were talking about this. Now, in the Middle East, like the big issues are things like Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And I think for Chinese companies, there's an idea that Chinese companies, state-owned enterprises, serve political agendas. And to an extent, that's true. They do, but they're also commercial entities. They want to go someplace where they can make a profit. And it doesn't really, you're not going to make much of a profit in war-torn countries like Libya, Yemen, or Syria. There's just no economic opportunity for them there. Now in Pakistan, this is part of a larger ambition that the party's already laid out through the BRI. And there is a logic there. There is no logic in a place like Syria. Syria offers Eastern Mediterranean ports potentially, but so does Haifa and Israel. You know, and you can just go through the Suez and avoid it altogether. So there's really no commercial logic that makes these high-risk environments in the Arab world make sense. And in terms of Iran, I think it's just that logic that there's a lot of reasons why Chinese companies are reluctant to go there. They're not all about, you know, sanctions. A lot of it is just that it's a very politicized economy. It's a very ideological economy. It's a very corrupt economy. It's hard enough for Iranians to operate in, let alone foreigners. For Chinese, what they realized is if you are a Chinese electronics manufacturer, you can sell low-end consumer products in Iran and make not much money. Or you can just go across the Gulf to Dubai and sell like really expensive stuff to a much more, you know, mature market. So they're like, yeah, we're just going where we'll make more money. So yeah, I mean, mostly it's just a commercial logic, I would say.
Hi, this is Robert Thomas here. You mentioned earlier that money and energy are really the two priorities that the PRC has eyes on in the region. And of course, energy security is also a significant strategic consideration for the PRC. Are there particular contexts or situations in the medium term in particular where you could see the PRC making a strategic decision to get involved in more of a heavy-handed diplomatic or security manner, specifically because of concerns about energy security emerging out of any developments in the Middle East?
No. I did a book, one of the books Sanam so generously listed at the start. It was called Asian Perceptions of Gulf Security. And we were working on this, I guess we rolled it out in 2020, so still in the first Trump administration. And that was still maximum pressure time when US policy towards Iran was leading to a very tense security environment in the Gulf. And me and my colleague put together some Gulf experts from Japan, Korea, Pakistan, India, Singapore, and China, and asked them a lot of security-related questions and said, you know, let's examine this. Your countries have deep economic engagement in this part of the world and a very shallow security presence. You need energy from the Gulf. Is your country having conversations about this? Is there any kind of view in Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Foreign Affairs to consider this region more strategically? And every case study came back with the same response, no. Almost all those countries were much more seriously preoccupied with events in their own region. You know, Japan would say worried about North Korea, South Korea is worried about North Korea, Singapore is worried about Indonesia, India is worried about Pakistan, and Pakistan's worried about India. everybody looked at the Gulf as a place where the U.S. is going to manage the security there. That the U.S. security umbrella, even if they resent it or dislike it in the case of China, they still very much enjoyed participating under it and not having to do anything to chip in. In China's case, there's a bigger question. Sanam mentioned something else I didn't mean to blow off or avoid, but there was talk about a Chinese facility in the UAE at one point a few years ago. And the Emiratis immediately said that's not at all what this is. And then immediately they shut down whatever the thing was. The US has more than 700 bases around the world. China has one. It's not even really a base. It's like a resupply hub in Djibouti. Everybody has something in Djibouti. It's like a rite of passage. If you have a navy, you're in Djibouti. China has no bases at all. So all of their commercial activity across the Indian Ocean region is taking place under the umbrella of the US Navy, really. And that is a massive strategic vulnerability that you think they'd address. China has been building a much larger navy. It's got now the biggest navy in terms of the number of ships in the world. But if you've been watching a lot of the tensions in the South China Sea, they're not particularly, what's a diplomatic way to say they're not very good at using them? I guess that's a problem with thinking out loud, isn't it? There's been a lot of cases where ships have been rammed or, like the other thing about this security issue between the US and China, China hasn't fought a war since 1979. The US has been fighting wars constantly since 1979. And whatever your particular view on that is, it means that the US military is really, really good at operations. Their chain of command, the officer training, everything works really well. China doesn't do that yet. So there's so many steps between China securing that energy and where they are right now. I don't even know where it would start. You would imagine things like there's talk of potentially building a facility in Cambodia. There's talk of something perhaps happening in Myanmar. The Gwadar port maybe could have some kind of dual use. You could see eventually how there might be kind of the early makings of some kind of supply network to project power beyond the South China Sea, but that's not where they are yet. So it's really quite it's quite far off before they're going to be able to be any kind of meaningful security actor in the region.
There are two questions here. Yes, you and then behind. Thank you.
Thank you for your insights, Professor Fulton. My name is Kang. I am a first-year IR student. I'm kind of curious about, since within the BRI there is the digital Silk Road initiative, and a big part of that is China's provision of surveillance and also technology transfer into Gulf countries and also countries like Egypt or Turkey. I was interested because China has a very particular security regime when it comes to like censorship and also surveillance. So how does that translate to like MENA region countries? And also what's like the end goal for China here? Is it just profit?
That's an awesome question following his question. If the mic was a little quiet, so I'm not sure if you heard, but it's about internal domestic surveillance. And that's really the model. Like when we think about China as a security actor, think about domestic security, because that's the thing that occupies most, like I said, occupies most of the party's time. How can we manage, all of these people inside our country, many of whom don't like us? And so regime security is the overriding imperative, and that drives a lot of the agenda. In 2022, China announced this global security initiative, which hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. But what it is kind of a normative approach to promoting alternative standards to security. The critique that China uses is that the West in general, and the US in particular, has promoted military security and using military responses to security issues. And China's saying, in our experience, that's not been the case. And China used a development-driven agenda to address its insecurity. So what they'll say is to other developing countries, that's a more realistic response for you. If you're facing instability in your own country, this is probably an economic issue. If you create more opportunities for your citizens, then you remove the incentives to be disruptive, to join, trans-state terrorist groups or whatever. So the idea here, I guess, is to promote these alternative norms about security. And with that comes with things like exporting surveillance technology and doing a lot of policing training, intelligence sharing, things that will help other countries address their own regime's security concerns. And of course, the Middle East is a perfect place to operationalize this, because that's the overriding concern for most Arab governments as well. How can we stay in power indefinitely? So there's a lot of stuff, like when we talk about China's security cooperation with Arab countries of the Middle East, I keep saying don't look for the mill-to-mill stuff, like that stuff's not happening. But this kind of private security, surveillance technology, this stuff is where the real action is. I actually know some folks in the Gulf who are Chinese security salespeople, I guess, and mostly it's how can we do a better job of watching the people in our country, and that's, I think, a really interesting part of the story.
Thank you. Was there another question up there?
Hi. I had a question. So you said that China mainly invests in risk-averse places in the Middle East. I was wondering if the recent strikes in Qatar raised any red flags for that market or that investment in terms of the Gulf as a region in general.
For the region in general, sure, but for China, no. One of the weird things about Qatar is it's really small physically, and most of it has been developed as much as possible because it hosted the FIFA World Cup a couple of years ago. As soon as FIFA was done, all the companies that were building all this stuff looked around and said, there's nothing left to do here. And they all went to Saudi. The month leading up to FIFA, you couldn't find a hotel room to save your life in Doha. The month after it was over, I mean, the hotels were running at like 10% occupancy. The other thing is China's never really been that invested in Qatar that much. Most of China's big plays in the region have happened since 2013. And there was a period between 2013 and 2017 when Doha looked like it might be a pretty lucrative market for Chinese companies. But then the split happened between Qatar and the other GCC countries. And at that moment, China went, okay, here's tiny, isolated Qatar without very many friends. And here's Saudi and the UAE and Egypt and Bahrain, connected to other markets, networked all over the region. We could support Qatar in this dispute and alienate the other countries with much bigger needs and much bigger economies and much bigger populations. But why would we do that? So they immediately said to Qatar, like, good luck, we will support you any way we can. And that's when Xi Jinping went to Abu Dhabi a few months later and said, the UAE's been playing a very constructive role in regional politics. You're a major partner for us. And they elevated the UAE to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So it was very clear, in that particular dispute, follow the money, and you could see where it worked. And Qatar has just kind of been on the margins. I think there's one over there too.
Hello, Professor. Thank you. My question is the reason China's relationships is different with the Gulf states than other states within the Arab world is because the Gulf states, and by the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or UAE, for example, aren't really susceptible to nefarious Chinese infrastructure projects of just being given huge loans to build infrastructure projects with the caveat that if you don't pay them back, that the Chinese state now owns them. And because of the Gulf's wealth, they either don't want them because they can pay for them themselves, or if they take Chinese loans, they can pay them back. Whereas nations like Pakistan or in Africa take these loans and then realize, oh, we can't pay them back.
Yeah, it's a great point. About 7 or 8 years ago, this narrative of debt trap diplomacy shaped how a lot of people spoke about Chinese projects in a lot of the world. And you can see like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, projects in Pakistan. In this case, you could see elements of a debt trap logic working. In the Gulf countries, I mean, there's so much money. They're just so rich. They don't need Chinese loans. They don't need Chinese investments. What they want are as many powerful partners as possible. So they'll work with Chinese companies. They're not so much worried about the economic logic. They don't have to worry about paying it back. And they know if the Chinese company isn't going to come in, on budget, they can just say, look, we'll go to the Germans next time or whatever. So they have leverage in this relationship that other countries don't. But I did hear a very interesting point. I was talking to a Qatari former minister about this, and he made the same point. There's no such thing as debt trap diplomacy for us. We don't care. However, we do care when the Iraqis, when the Egyptians take on these ridiculous loans and then come to us in 5 or 10 years and say, we need help restructuring this, or we need money to pay this stuff off. So their concern was that things China was doing in the broader region could lead to problems that will eventually affect them. So there was a concern that maybe there should be more dialogue happening within the Arab League to address this kind of before it becomes an issue.
Let me just jump in really quickly and ask a question, because China also has comprehensive strategic partnerships beyond the UAE and Saudi Arabia with Iran, but also with Egypt and Algeria.
Yes.
And you haven't really talked about them. Why Egypt and Algeria, and how developed are those relationships? Are they more dependent because the economics are slightly different?
Sure. I'll do Algeria first. It's just a legacy of Chinese support for the Algerians during the colonial war. The party puts a lot of stock in its history and helping other countries. So, like, for example, the North Korean relationship is deeply problematic for China. However, Mao Zedong's son died in that war. This was the first incidence of China being a major power as People's Republic. So no matter what North Korea does, it's very hard for them to disavow themselves of them because of this legacy. And the same thing with Algeria. You see very little. I mean, I've got it here because I gave a talk the other day. Somebody in North Africa was asking about Chinese investment. There's been one Chinese investment in Algeria since 2005. There's very little happening there. But Egypt's a different thing. Egypt is very interesting. So without going too deep in the weeds of Egyptian domestic politics, when President Sisi literally took power in 2015, was it 15, 14? He did this with, obviously the most important bilateral relationship is with the US, but deeply, deeply angry about how the Obama administration threw Hosni Mubarak under the bus. And there's a sense that the US is unreliable, that Egypt had this massive vulnerability, that its most important partner wasn't trustworthy, and he was very angry. And one of his first overseas, if not his first overseas visit, was to China, and they signed this comprehensive strategic partnership in 2015. And what you can see is, if you track, which I did in the book, if you track the economic relations from that point forward, it just exploded, right? Like in terms of Chinese contracting, especially along the Suez corridor, all the free trade zones and things, Chinese companies have just gotten billions and billions and billions of dollars. A lot of this is because Egypt has been trying to build their value as a chip, to say to China, look, you need us. Sisi has been to China 9 times since he took office. Mubarak, in the 30 years he was president, went to China 6 times. He was, I think, 3 high-level visits to China last year alone. They called it the Sino-Egyptian, the year of Sino-Egyptian friendship. And they said this was the end of the golden decade. So the golden decade is from 2015 to when they signed this partnership to all of the things that have happened since. And one of the weird things about that relationship is Egypt will constantly tout the fact that China is their biggest trade partner, which is absolutely true. But when you look at the numbers, the volume of trade is big. I think by Egyptian standards, the last year I saw was 23, and I think it was worth $14 billion. Of that 14 billion, 13 plus, maybe it was like 12.8, something like that, was Chinese exports to Egypt. and they were exporting electronics, consumer goods, food, everything. The 1 billion, whatever was left, was Egyptian energy exports to China. So a deeply, deeply asymmetrical economic relationship that creates tremendous vulnerabilities for the Egyptian side, especially given that the one thing China's buying from them is the same thing that China says they don't want to buy any of within the next 20 to 30 years. You know, they want to stop buying, importing hydrocarbons. And Egypt's like, well, what else do we have to sell them, right? So it's a very deep, interesting relationship, but it's a very complicated one.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Hey, Professor Fulton, thank you so much for talking to us today. My name is Mitchell. I wanted to ask a bit about Syria because you mentioned the Uyghur minorities that are part of the militias there. Now that the West has started raising sanctions off of Syria and now Syria's slowly rebuilding, how do you see the long-term outlook with China relations in terms of Syria? Will they ever reapproach Syria given that the militias are there, or is that a total non-issue for them?
Well, reapproach is kind of, China's done very little in Syria ever. You know, there was a couple of small projects before 2010. There wasn't much happening. And then after the civil war started in Syria, China just dropped them immediately. So they'd be starting from, basically the absolute basement. There's very little to do. They say all the right things when they talk about Syria, supporting them and building this, this transitional moment and trying to help them. But they also say they're very deeply, deeply worried about the role of extremists in the Syrian military. When I was talking about those concentric circles, the things that impact China, how they consider their foreign policy, China's Minister of Foreign Affairs uses this phrase core interests in a way that is very consistent. It's not like a general, like this is our core interests are, they have a list of things and they're almost all domestic issues. The only thing that's not really domestic is depending on your view of Taiwan or depending on your view of the 9-dash line for the South China Sea. But generally, China's core interests are what affects our domestic political economy. There is nothing in the Middle East that does this until December, when suddenly Uyghur militia members became part of Syria's military. And one of them actually gave a statement, allegedly to, I think, a British newspaper, saying something to the effect of, we've taken up Bashar al-Assad and now we're going after the party, right? So the people in China take that very seriously. If there is an animated group of Uyghur separatists that have had success in overthrowing a government, they kind of look at that as a Taliban type moment, right? And they don't want to see this come back and have a blowback scenario in Xinjiang. So they're very positive in how they talk about Syria, but you can see how they also want to really quarantine it and keep it away from anything that has the potential to come back and affect them domestically.
Thank you. I think there's some more questions in the back.
Thank you so much for sharing. My question is about U.S.-China relation in the Middle East. So as you are talking about, Middle East wasn't a really core interest of China. So, but I feel like both U.S. and China can both benefit from a stable regional environment. So, do you think it's feasible? Is it likely for U.S.-China to work on this peace building in Middle East collaboratively, or it's more like a confrontational environment?
Man, I wish. So the first thing I did for the Atlantic Council, I wrote this report for them in 2019, and it went over pretty well, I think, because most people in the Atlantic Council is based in Washington. I don't think many people in Washington had given a lot of thought about China and the Middle East at that point. And I ended up talking with some people in Washington who were deeply concerned about this issue, like the way you framed it, to say, there are so many areas where America's interests in the Middle East and China's interests in the Middle East align. I'd say the U.S. interests in the Middle East are, keeping energy going to global markets, keeping freedom of navigation, and Israeli security. Those are the three things that preoccupy the US, I think, in the Middle East. And I think for China, the first two are also their interests. I don't think China cares a whole lot about Israeli security, but I think they do care about regional stability, for market access. So you can see how they're motivated by largely the same stuff, and you'd think there's an area there that leaves the potential for coordination. I use the word cooperation. We were trying to start a track 2 dialogue, and I naively said China-US cooperation in the Middle East, and somebody gave me a big elbow and said, don't say cooperation, say coordination. There's areas where we could coordinate policy initiatives where it could be, whether it's a good cop, bad cop thing or whatever, but there are things that matter. And that was in 2019. We had a lot of interest, and we had funding to start this dialogue where we would bring a group of Chinese Middle East experts and American Middle East experts together in a Middle Eastern capital city, a different one every 6 months, for a continuous dialogue about areas of mutual interest and how can people go back home and talk to their governments about this. And of course, COVID happened, and that kind of stopped. But also just the deterioration in the US-China relationship just really hit this point where it felt like if there's consensus on anything in Washington, if there's a bilateral consensus on anything, it was that China's a threat. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, that was gospel. So it's very hard to find people who are willing to work on an issue that was seen as building a bridge with China. And it's not just an American issue. The same was true in China, where, the idea of cooperating with the US when the US is seen as a massive threat as well. There's a lot of suspicion on the Chinese side, and frankly, I found it very, very difficult to find Chinese academics who were willing to do that because they were worried, how would this look for us back home if we've been talking to these American academics? This is going to create serious problems for us. So I don't think so.
Can I ask you to share what topics you were talking about?
I mean, sure, it was mostly the same stuff you would normally expect, I'm trying to think. I mean, it's probably in here someplace.
I hope you have a new one since 2019.
Yeah, this one's getting pretty ratty.
Okay.
This is just one I use for special occasions.
I see. Okay.
But no, I mean, mostly it was coordination. So it's talking about, economic corridors, science, technological cooperation, educational, it was things that are deeply political, but also not problematic, right? Let's start building on the small stuff, small, but important stuff that is not going to raise any flags.
Is there another question back there? Any further questions? I still have 2 questions.
I think maybe I just want to understand kind of the overarching idea there. So do you think the Middle East then is a good point for just kind of doing a more neutral diplomacy? Because it's really tense, right? In other regions it might be more difficult, but do you think in the Middle East there's actually opportunity for US and China relations to kind of coordinate? And maybe long term that could have good effects on bilateral relations between US and China?
I think I don't think there's a likelihood of it right now, because the broader picture, right? You can't really silo off the Middle East from what's happening in other parts of the world where China-US tensions are pretty at a high level. So if you were talking about the Middle East as a place where we could come in and lower the temperature, that might be true, but you can't just step away from what's happening in something like the South China Sea. So I don't really think so. What's interesting, I'm working on my next book with a colleague who's a Russia expert, and we're looking at how the great power competition in the Middle East is playing out with Russia and China, their behavior in the region, which is a really interesting topic, I think. Of course, I think it's my book. But one of the things that animates us in this is that the Middle East isn't that important to either country, right? Russia is obsessed, obviously, with Europe. China's obsessed with Asia. That means the Middle East becomes a place where they can play geopolitics, because it doesn't matter that much to them. It's a place where they can do business, or it's a place where they can cause a ruckus. You know, they can both work with Iran to keep the US off guard, for example. And it doesn't really affect them too much closer to home. So, I mean, really, I don't see a lot of positive right now. I think it's an occupational hazard that political scientists generally aren't very positive people when we think about the future. I don't see this being a place where China and the US are going to, you know, fix their problems.
So another question, when Trump meets Xi Jinping, are they even going to talk about anything in the region? Is it like will it even be on the agenda?
Middle East?
Yes, anything in the Middle East. I don't know, Iran leaving the NPT or anything. Item number 10.
I doubt it. I mean, items number 1 through 90
Yes.
are so, you know, consequential, right? It's pretty rare. Like, so for example, the Anchorage summit that happened when the Biden team came in, they sent Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, the 2 top foreign policy guys in China, and Jake Sullivan and who was it? I can't even remember anymore. Anyway,
Doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter.
They're gone.
Yeah, they're all writing their memoirs. But there was a moment like 2 days before when the Chinese Undersecretary of State equivalent had said, look, Iran we're deeply, deeply concerned about Iran's nuclear program. We have information, like we've got to work together on Iran. I imagine that was something that was on the agenda back then, because that was a point when that was really important. Right now, I think, I mean, Russia, if they're going to talk about another country, it's Russia.
And so in thinking about your forthcoming book, are you subscribing to this Western terminology that is often used or abused in the media of the axis of upheaval or whatever they're called these days? Is there an axis, or is it also just
What a crappy
transactional
axis,
and
right?
convenient?
It's such a crappy axis. I'm actually doing a report on that. I was asked by somebody had a grant to look at this axis from 4 different, you know, somebody writing about China, somebody about Russia. And so I've been working on that quite a bit lately. And honestly, like, as an axis, you can see their support for each other is problematic for other countries, obviously. I don't know if there's any kind of deep coordination on most of these things. You know, how much happens at the North Korea-Iran side of the axis. I mean, I know there's some, because I know people who are finding all sorts of weird North Korean parts in Iranian drones, things like this. But no, the book doesn't really look at that. I think mostly what we're looking at is how do policymakers in Russia or in China see this playing out.
Okay. Yes.
Second question. I wanted to kind of try and relate the Middle East back to the domestic situation in China by asking what the nature of the Chinese investments are in the Middle East, and if it's quite like heavily construction based, whether that will then be affected if China ever resolves its excess capacity issues at home. Like, will the money and production which needs to flow out of China, if that ever gets stopped by the Middle East, will that become an issue for China? Because the Middle East has just developed as much as it needs to.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it really depends which country you're looking at. So in Saudi and the UAE, for example, a lot of the investment traditionally has been in the energy sector, which obviously makes a lot of sense. However, those countries have pretty ambitious development agendas, the Vision 20 whatever, right? In Saudi, the Vision 2030, the Abu Dhabi Vision 2030. All of these are about building kind of post-hydrocarbon economies, so they're very tech reliant. And Chinese tech companies have been making big waves in both of those countries. In Egypt, you're seeing a lot of manufacturing. So like a lot of Chinese companies are setting up factories in the Suez trade zone, mostly to crack into local or African markets. And Morocco is an interesting one, that nothing happened between China and Morocco for decades. And then over the past 2 or 3 years, it's just exploded. And a lot of that is EV stuff, you know, whether it's building components or building EV batteries. And it's very interesting to me because I didn't realize, I don't know much about Morocco, to be honest. When you're doing China in the Middle East, there's some countries that you're dealing with like 22 countries, right? So I'm always happy when something like Syria or Libya, nothing happens. I'm like, great, I can just take that country and ignore it forever. And Morocco was one of those countries. And in the past year and a half, Morocco is like in the other basket now. I think it's because Morocco has an FTA, a free trade agreement with the EU. China can't sell electric vehicles in the EU, but Morocco can. So you're seeing a lot of Chinese parts being built in Morocco to enter the European market. It's something I noticed walking around today with my wife. We live in Abu Dhabi. We're used to seeing massive like Ford F-150 trucks everywhere, and we're used to seeing Chinese EVs everywhere. And we're like, wow, we're walking around Italy, we haven't seen a single big pickup truck or a Chinese EV. So they're investing a lot in that. And they're doing that also in Turkey, I think for pretty much the same purpose. So that's it. I mean, mostly it's stuff that is addressing, like the EVs is absolutely addressing excess capacity issue for overproduction in China with a domestic market that just can't consume any more of this stuff. In other things, it's mostly how does our commercial interests align with that country's development agenda? And you can see there's a lot of synergy between these countries' visions and what Chinese companies have been doing under the auspices of the BRI. I joke often that McKinsey, who wrote most of the visions, must have also written the BRI.
Yes. Hi, thank you again, Professor Fulton. My name is Linda Baguma. I'm just out of curiosity, just listening to your points in terms of China's core principles within the Middle East. It's more transactional. However, I want to connect that to the continent of Africa to see if you could make that same conclusion in terms of China's partnerships in the Middle East to go hand in hand with their partnership on the continent of Africa.
It's like sub-Saharan Africa, right?
Yes, sub-Saharan.
Yeah.
Particular.
So this is interesting. That's the second time this came up this week. And I'm really interested in this line of thinking. When you look at North Africa, you see a region where China was always not very present. And I think the logic is that North Africa was really seen as a European kind of sphere of interest, right? That those markets were pretty much locked up by European companies, and there's very little opportunity. But the same logic doesn't hold in sub-Saharan Africa, which most of the West pretty happily abandoned as soon as the Cold War was over, right? Like a lot of Western companies or countries were present in sub-Saharan Africa to compete with the Soviets. And when the Soviets wasn't animating their foreign policy, like, hey, we don't need to worry about that anymore. And you saw kind of a very calloused, disinterest. So I think when China looked at sub-Saharan Africa, what they saw was, wow, that's amazing low-hanging fruit, right? You've got like a lot of developing economies, growing middle classes, improving education. Like this is going to be massive markets for us, and nobody else is interested. So I think for them it was, hey, let's just go in and do stuff. It's going to be amazing. So I don't think there's really much strategic. I think they just saw it as a really great business opportunity.
And when do you think, you said that the US or other Western countries shouldn't necessarily be worried about, China as a threat. So when should the US be worried? Like what actions does China have to take for the US to be worried?
Well, I don't think they have to be worried about China in the Middle East. Like I said, in Canada, we see what China's doing in our politics, in our universities. It is problematic. And I think over the past decade or so, we've certainly got a much more robust response to that because it's been necessary. I talk to American China experts a lot, and a lot of American China experts who work for the government, and they're world class. Like, they are the best. I'm not just being nice because Johns Hopkins invited me. Like, it's really, really impressive the depth of expertise and knowledge that you find in the U.S. government on China. And that goes across agencies, across departments. People have been paying attention to this for quite a while. And I think they've right-sized at an operational or governmental level. Somebody should probably tell the politicians, because, you know, if you listen to politicians talk about it, you'll be terrified because they're trying to drum up votes, you know. The reality between the way it's being portrayed in the press and by ambitious politicians is very different. Like if you talk to the people, the foreign policy guy for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, their staffers are incredible. If you talk to people in State Department who are at the China House, like there's a program that's the State Department rolled out in 2019. It's called the Regional China Officers Program. These are U.S. Foreign Service officers who have very like fluent Chinese skills. They've had postings in China. They are deeply knowledgeable about China, and they're really good diplomats. And they're not like, they're very serious, smart, committed people. And I've seen that all across government. So I don't think really it's something to be too worried about. I think just at a day-to-day level, it's been very appropriately addressed.
Last question over there.
Has China's relationship with the Middle East also not been affected by kind of the present day legacy of xenophobic and Islamophobic nature towards Islamic culture or cultural groups that have Islamic tendencies within China, and then Islamophobia in China? Has it affected their relationship with the Middle East at all? Because historically, they haven't gotten along with the Uyghurs or anybody kind of in the west of China.
Wow. Let's take, for the last question, the one that's going to take like 3 hours to get through. Yeah, especially under Xi Jinping, you know, there's been this idea of Chinese religions and then foreign religions. And foreign religions, certainly Islam and Judaism and Christianity, are seen as very foreign, and there's been a crackdown. It's been very hard to practice your faith if you are, you know, of those faiths. And of course, anybody with a newspaper subscription knows what's been happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang for the past decade plus. That doesn't have any bearing on most Arab countries' relations with China. The only country that it does really have much of an effect on is Turkey, because the Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic people. And Erdogan's challenge to, you know, as a leader of Sunni Islam puts him in opposition to the Saudis, and the Saudis love to use that as a wedge with him to say, oh, if you're the leader of all of the Muslims, then you're the guy who has to go fix Xinjiang, right? So there is a bit of that, you know, intra-Middle Eastern competition that plays out. But I think at a more important level, you know, when I said core issues for China, I think all of these countries also have core issues. And what happens in Western China ain't a core issue. You know, they don't care. It's not that important. On a human level, of course they care. It's terrible. On a Muslim level, that, you know, they'd be very upset to learn that this is happening. But what happens in Xinjiang doesn't drive any kind of political behavior in Saudi or in the UAE or in Egypt, you know. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is, you know, it never gets reported. You know, most of the media in those countries are state-owned. So there are certain issues that don't come up in the news, and that's one of them.
But isn't it also that a lot of Middle Eastern governments very much appreciate China's policy of non-interference, and so they try to mirror that at least back to China, because they don't really appreciate a lot of that olden day Western sort of finger wagging about human rights and things like that.
Is that something we did?
Well, we certainly don't do it anymore.
I mean, there is an element of that, but I mean, just on a deeper level, I think this isn't something, like I said, that's going to animate a lot of people in those countries. My students who are international studies majors know remarkably little about what happens in Xinjiang. Now, there could be an instrumental reason where the leaders of the countries think we would rather our people not know about this because it could interfere with our economic relationship with China, which is probably more likely than, we appreciate their non-interference. I think the idea is, why would we touch that nerve? What do we get from it, right? If we go to the UN and, have a moment where we're like, China does a bad thing and we're telling everybody that we're mad, like, what do you get, really? You're not going to get a lot of support at home because people will be like, it doesn't matter to us the same way you think it does. I mean, I have a Saudi friend, and this came up in a webinar we were doing, and it's kind of like the gotcha moment where somebody's like, well, you're a Saudi and you're a Muslim, and why do you like China when China does this thing? And he's like, if a Christian gets killed someplace, like, do you get all worked up? Do you go to your government and demand action? Like, why does it work that way if it's a Muslim, but not if it's somebody else, right? I mean, it's just something that I think the logic is primarily we stand to gain nothing from it and we stand to lose a lot. The core interest bit comes back, right? Like when Liu Xiaobo, a Chinese professor turned dissident, was nominated for won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010. At the time, he didn't show up in Oslo to collect because he was in jail. And the Chinese government took that as a deeply insulting moment. And suddenly all the Norwegian salmon just sat on a dock and rotted. And they said, we're not doing business with you. If you're going to insult us, then we're done with you. China has like a hierarchy of tools in their economic statecraft. And one of them, the sharp one, is coercion. We can force you to do stuff you don't want to do. We'll deny you market access. We'll shut down your trade with us. We'll do something. And there's been a number of incidents where when South Korea was getting, not harassed, that's too mild, but North Korea was threatening and being very aggressive towards South Korea back in 2015. South Korea allowed the US government to put this THAAD missile defense system in South Korean territory. China took that as a threat, and they immediately organized kind of an unofficial boycott against South Korean department stores. They blocked Chinese tourism to South Korea. They made it very uncomfortable for them to economically benefit from the relationship. And I think countries in the Middle East watched that and said, we could say something about the Uyghurs. We're going to get the same treatment. For what? What benefit?
Thank you. There's so much more we could talk about, including how you see this evolving, sovereign wealth fund investment. I had so many questions for you, Vision 2030.
I'll have to come back.
You'll have to come back, and we can expand the conversation certainly to also think about Russia's role and how these two countries play in the Middle East. But until then, let's thank Professor Fulton for his time and sharing his expertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. That was fun.
Yes.